I'm Klaus Troitzsch, and I've been active in the field of computational social science for more than 3 decades now. I worked at the University of Koblenz for 30 years, and now I'm retired and continue my research work. Well, I got involved in complexity science because I was educated as a political scientist and a social scientist, and both these sciences are about complex systems because they are composed of elements which themselves are complex. And this means that from the very beginning of my studies, I was interested in complex systems and revealing what is behind the complexity of these systems. Well, my current role in complexity science is trying to find a way of validating models of complex systems against empirical data. There's a long line of research building complex computational models which do not exactly relate to empirical data, but just to stylize facts, what we think about complex systems. And I think for the progress of science, of the science of complexity, it is necessary to check the validity of our models, to check whether, for example, the predictions we make with our complex models have anything to do with real complex systems. You asked me about my relation to agent-based models. Well, this again has to do with my original education. Social science is about human actors, and if we want to model them computationally, then in a way the most natural technique would be to represent actors with software agents who can perform at least similar behavior and actions. And I guess before the word of agent-based modeling was invented, there already existed agent-based computational models, perhaps even 50 years ago, and my first attempts nowadays, I would say, were agent-based models, but before the word existed. I think this is too big a word, it being a tipping point, and it is not a tipping point because it has meanwhile it has some history. It is a new way of thinking about social theories. These can now be formalized in a computational manner, which was not possible before we had very powerful computers at our hands. So 30 years ago, all this, what we were talking during this conference, would not have been possible. One would have had to wait for hours until the first results came out, and now we can show videos which condense a history of several months into a couple of seconds. But, I think the concept of self-organization is still not understood by policymakers because they believe that it is them who organize a system and are never aware that there is something within the system which is independent of all those who try to control the system. So I think it is really necessary to convince stakeholders, policymakers, that there is an inborn mechanism to these complex systems which they can only halfway control. There's a long tradition of the metaphor of the invisible hand, which is something representing self-organization. And sometimes it seems, and Adam Smith put this 300 or 250 years ago, this invisible hand is sometimes more proficient in finding good solutions than those who try to organize a system against its self-organizing tendency. Networks have always been very important in any kind of social systems, from parliaments down to children's groups. And to understand these networks is, or for the typical policymaker, is necessary because he is part of a network and he wants to get control of part of this network. So he or she would be well advised if they learned more about how networks function. But from my personal experience, I was a policymaker for a couple of years, 30 years ago. I know that most policymakers have a very good feeling of how networks work. You're right. The concept of self-organization and emergence allows me to explain to myself and to understand what happens around me. So I'm usually not surprised if I see that something comes up, a new phenomenon, which I can explain to myself and which I can even write a computational model of. I think if people want to get into the field of complexity and uncertainty and self-organization, they will have to have a good mathematical training, because we can only understand these complex systems if we are able to formalize them, if you can make computational models of these, and for this it's a prerequisite that one has the tools at one's fingertips.